Hello, professional fantasy football players. Welcome to the weekly Waiver Wire show. As always, I'm your host, Josh Martin. You know how this show works. It's week 7. If you don't by now, if this is your first time tuning in, then thank you. On this show, I'm going to give you guys I think you should add to your team who can be good bye-week fill-ins or every week starter, plus guys who you should drop. Now, this week's show is going to be a little bit different. It is week 7, which means we're over halfway through the PFFL season, which means the teams at the top need to start looking at playoffs, start looking at winning your tier so you can move up into tier 2 or tier 1. And guys at the bottom need to start making moves to get into that hunt, right? You pay, you're professionals. You're here to win. You're not here to lose. So I'm going to get you there. This show's going to be a little bit different, and I'll tell you how. The guys I have for you to drop, I put together a list of guys. I went through every single player at each position, and I found guys whose ownership percentage in the PFFL universe are too high and should be dropped. These are guys that haven't produced all year, but are for some reason still on rosters. So if you have one of those guys, stay tuned, because you need to drop them, and soon. But as always, we start with my desperation pick. It's the out-of-the-pocket pick of the week.
He drops back, under pressure, scrambling around. He's out of the pocket. He's got to find someone.
So again, if this is your first time listening to the show, in this segment I give you one guy who, if you're desperate, who if you lost a few guys because of injuries, if your team is riddled with buys, there's 5 teams on a buy this week, this is the guy you can pick up, and it might get you anywhere from 7 to 10 points. It's probably a flex play at best, but it could get you some good production. This week's guy is wide receiver from the New York Jets, Stephen Hill, the rookie. He's a big target. He's becoming a favorite red zone target of Mark Sanchez. Last week in week 6, he got 8 points, and his matchups for the next 2 weeks I think are really good. At New England and home against Miami. Then the Jets are on a bye, but then your team's going to be filled out from the bye weeks that you're suffering through right now. So you might not need him in 2 weeks. And then they're at Seattle after that, and you definitely don't want to play him in that matchup, obviously. But for the next 2 weeks, I think they've got good matchups. I think you can throw on New England, and I think you can throw on Miami. And like I said, when they get down into the red zone, Mark Sanchez is looking for the rookie. He's scoring touchdowns, and that's what you need out of your flex, or if you have to use him. I wouldn't recommend him as a wide receiver too, but if you have to use him, that's the guy I think you should use. And pick him up. His ownership percentage in PFFL is only 4. So he's probably not owned in your league. If he is, good for you if you're the guy that owns him. If not, you need to pick him up today. All right, let's go position by position, guys. I think you should add. Starting at the quarterback position, I have been beating this guy's drum since this show started. But just in case, again, if it's your first time listening, Christian Ponder, quarterback for the Minnesota Vikings. His ownership percentage has moved up to 80, which is great. It needs to be 100. Last week I told you he was a good bye-week fill-in. That's not true. From now on, he is a top 10 guy in my rankings. Remember, my weekly rankings come out on Friday, along with the Stardom Situm show that I do every week. He will be in the top 10 every week. Now, in a couple weeks, he goes up against Seattle, so maybe not that week. But next week, Arizona, then Tampa Bay, and after Seattle, it's Detroit. All of those weeks, he will be a top 10 play. That offense is for real, and Christian Ponder is for real. If he's not owned in your league, go pick him up. You can start him basically every week. Next 2 guys are good bye-week fill-ins. Brandon Whedon, owned in 0%. Looks like that Cleveland offense is starting to make strides, starting to come together. That might be a theme coming up in a couple of positions. Teaser. You like that? Yeah, I do those too. But Whedon's the linchpin that is holding that offense together. He's the one. He's 29 years old. He's not your typical rookie. He's got experience. He's the guy that is the reason that offense is starting to click. And I think he can be in a roster in PFFL and be a good bye-week fill, like I said. Next guy is Josh Freeman, quarterback for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Next 2 weeks, actually next 4 weeks, are great matchups for Freeman. New Orleans this week, you think you can throw on them? Yeah, me too. At Minnesota, not a great matchup, but a good one. At Oakland, and then San Diego. All teams you can throw on. All teams that Tampa Bay is going to be able to do things against. Freeman's ownership percentage, it's 71, so it's high. But look for him. If he's not owned in your league, pick him up today. Moving on to the running back position, I got a couple of injury fill-ins. Felix Jones, running back for the Dallas Cowboys. DeMarco Murray hurt last week. Looks like he's probably going to be out at least a week or two. Felix Jones, not a great guy, not a great running back, not great matchups the next 4 weeks, but going to be the guy that gets the carries. Now, if you're looking for someone you're desperate and you hate Felix Jones, believe me, I've been there. I get it. Nobody wants to trust their team to Felix Jones, especially late in the season. Philip Tanner might be an interesting pickup, but I think Felix is the one that's going to get the bulk of the carries. If you tell me that means you want to stay away from Dallas running backs, I'm not going to blame you. Tweet it to me. Remember, you can follow me on Twitter at JoshMartin33, where you can ask me any ad or drop questions all week long. I'll answer as many as I can. Next up, Trent Richardson got hurt this week. Looks like, again, going to be out probably 2 to 4 weeks. Montario Hardesty is going to be the one that gets the carries. He came in last week, did a good job, got 11 points. He is owned in only 19% of PFFL. Next few weeks at Indianapolis, you think you can run on him? Sean Green? Yeah, I think so. San Diego, and then Baltimore. And then he's got a bye. But all 3 teams you can run on. And I think Hardesty could be not only a good bye week fill-in, but actually could be a good flex position, flex starter every week, even a running back too. The next guy isn't an injury replacement, but he's starting to get a lot of timeshare responsibilities, and that's Daryl Richardson for St. Louis. Steven Jackson had 12 carries last week. Daryl Richardson had 11. So what they're starting to do, it looks like the coaching staff really likes Richardson. They came out last week and they said this is the guy they want to get involved in the offense, and they're starting to do that. Steven Jackson is still obviously the number one, but his production's down. He's getting old. Daryl Richardson is making the most out of his opportunities. And the next few weeks, Green Bay, New England, and then a bye. So both those teams you can run on. And like I said, it's not about Steven Jackson being hurt. But Daryl Richardson is a guy that, if you're desperate at running back, I think he's a good running back too, or even a flex. He's only owned in 47% of PFFL, so he needs to be on a roster. Moving on to wide receivers, my out-of-the-pocket guy from last week had another great performance, Josh Gordon from the Cleveland Browns. Told you there'd be a theme this week. Only owned in 4% of PFFL still. So I get it. Questions. Can he be consistent? I understand. He's a rookie. He's got raw talent, but hasn't proven himself a lot. I totally agree. Here's the thing. That offense, like I said, is just starting to click. Gordon's emerging as their number one. Second straight week over 15 points. He's just going to keep packing them on, keep racking up the points. Only owned in 4%. Put him on your team. This week against Indianapolis, I think you can start him. He's probably going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 25th in my wide receiver rankings this week because of the matchup against Indianapolis. So pick him up, and I think you can start him. Brandon Stokely, oldest wide receiver in the league, starting to become a target for Peyton Manning. Again, guy, if you're desperate, he's only owned in 4% of the PFFL. Now, they're on a bye this week. So, generally speaking, I tell you not to pick up guys who are on buys because you don't want to waste a roster spot. Problem is, in Week 8, they play New Orleans. In Week 9, Cincinnati. And in Week 10, Carolina. Great matchups for the Denver passing game. I think you can get Stokely cheap this week, and I think you should pick him up. And I think stash him away at the bottom of your roster. You're obviously not playing him. He's on a bye. But against New Orleans, I think you're starting him. Whether it's flex, wide receiver 2, I think he's a start because they're going to be spreading the ball around. Demaryius Thomas, still a top 5 guy. Eric Decker, still a top 15 guy. Stokely is a guy who can start in the flex for you, especially going down the stretch with those matchups. Last guy I want to talk about adding, another guy I talked about last week, still only owned in 19% of leagues. That's Brandon Gibson, wide receiver for the St. Louis Rams. Scored 9 points last week. Not great, but again, good matchups the next 2 weeks. Green Bay, New England. St. Louis at home against those two teams. St. Louis is probably going to be behind against both of those teams. They're going to have to throw the ball. Brandon Gibson is sort of emerging along with Chris Givens as the top guys for Bradford now that Amendola is hurt. So those are guys I think you should add. Remember, again, Send me tweets. Comment on our Facebook page at the PFFL. Ask any questions you have. I'm here for you. I want to get you guys to your next tier. I want to get you a win. I want to make sure you make the playoffs. I want to make sure you have success in the playoffs and start getting paid. You're professional fantasy football players. Having said that, that leads me into the guys I think you should drop. If you own any of the following players, they should no longer be on your roster. I'm not looking at schedules, I'm not looking at matchups, I'm not looking at points, I'm not looking at rankings this week. I'll go back to that next week. But these are guys that I found when I was doing a search, doing some research on the PFFL.com, who still have way too high ownership percentage. So let's start at running back. Roy Halou, he's owned in 42% of leagues. And let's say at that team, it's Evan Royster, who's owned in 80%. Alfred Morris is their guy. Let's say what you want about Morris the last couple weeks. He hasn't produced as much as he did the first few weeks. But Shanahan is no longer the Shanahan of last year. He's not going to pull a trick on you and all of a sudden slip Royster or Hulu in. And even if he is, if you're the guy that's owning one of those guys because you expect that to happen, can you tell me when that's going to happen? No. So you're never going to start either of those guys. Drop them. Next guy, Jackie Battle. Still owned in 95% of PFFL leagues. If you are one of the guys who owns Jackie Battle, drop him. Even if you're a Ryan Matthews owner, drop him. There are other guys you can pick up who can give you production. Jackie Battle scored 0 points in 2 straight weeks. Ryan Matthews is back. He's their number one. Andre Brown of the New York Giants, owned in 61% of leagues. I told you, had that great week against Carolina, right? Don't buy into it. I didn't. Carolina was a bad tackling team. They still are. And that week, if you really paid attention to the game, Brown broke a lot of tackles that were arm and shoulder tackles. It's great. He's got a little bit of talent. Fair enough. But Coughlin came out and said he likes David Wilson's talent, he likes his speed, and wants to get him more involved in the offense. Andre Brown's taking a back seat. Drop him. Speaking of back seats, Kevin Smith for the Detroit Lions. My frustrating Detroit Lions. Owned in 47% of leagues. Not involved in the offense at all anymore. It's Mikel LaShore and Joik Bell. Kevin Smith should not be on your team. Mark Ingram of the Saints on a bye week last week. Fair enough. Still owned in 76% of leagues. No production whatsoever for Ingram this year. Drop him. Shouldn't be on your team. Ryan Williams, who was on the IR, out for the season, still owned in 38% of leagues. If you are a guy still owning Ryan Williams, wake up. Pay attention. Drop him. There's guys you can go get. Moving on to wide receivers, Pierre Garçon is owned in 100% of leagues. Still not 100% healthy, unfortunately. And not giving you enough production to warrant a roster spot at this point. There's guys like Josh Gordon, Brandon Stokely, Brandon Gibson, even Stephen Hill, who at this point I would start over Pierre Garçon. Kevin Ogletree had that one great week. Everybody picked him up, and it looks like some people still keep him on their roster. He's 47% owned. Get him off of there. Same thing with Brandon LaFell. Had a nice couple of weeks in the beginning of the year. Just production's gone downhill ever since then. 67% ownership for Brandon LaFell. Drop him. And last, but certainly not least, Santonio Holmes on the IR, still owned in 43% of leagues. Drop him. Doesn't need to be on your roster at all. So that's the weekly waiver wire show for week 7. Hope I give you guys who you can add and who you can drop to get you a win. That's what I'm here for. Remember, again, you can follow me on Twitter at JoshMartin33. Send me any questions you have about who you should add or who you should drop. Listen to all the great PFFL Radio Network content we have. Wednesday is not only the weekly waiver wire show, but it's the GoPro show with the Fantasy Geek. Thursday is PFFL Live with John Hampton. And Friday is the Stardom Cinema show with yours truly. Plus Saturday is Breaking News, PFFL Live. I'm your host, Josh Martin. Keep smiling, keep listening, and always look both ways.